At the moment, we're a long way off so-called super intelligent AI, but even the specialized AI, that's the sort that's tuned to a specific task, that's currently in widespread use, well, that's already rendering many human endeavors redundant, even if it is providing the potential to improve living standards. Well, thank you. Yes, I did spend 11 years advising on monetary policy at the bank, and much of my career in the city trying to predict and explain central bank actions. And certainly central banks have had a pretty rough trot over the last few years, with inflation getting up to levels that we haven't really seen since the 1970s. And at the same time, we've been experiencing depressed economic activity, so-called stagflation. And this has been driven up by higher commodity and food prices, mostly caused by the war in Ukraine. Now, we're starting to see those prices falling back, and so we should see inflation fall back just as sharply on the way down as it rose sharply on the way up. Of course, the risk is that central bankers worry about is that firms and households will get used to that high inflation, and they'll start to bake that into the expectations of what's going to happen. I think the fact that the bank has a clear inflation target has helped to avoid that risk, though even so, they've come in for a lot of flack lately, including from a recent House of Lords report. Well, at the moment, the expectations reflected in financial markets is that interest rates have peaked, both here and in the US and euro area, and then they're now set to start falling, perhaps to 4% by mid-2025, maybe as low as 3.5% in a couple of years after that. Actually, I think they might even fall more quickly than that as inflation starts to surprise on the downside. And while I don't expect to see rates fall to the incredibly low levels that we saw in the 2010s after the financial crisis, we could see mortgage rates, say, falling from their current high levels, perhaps to around 3%, and company borrowing rates should fall accordingly. Yes, unfortunately, they've played a very big role, and really for decades, both here in the UK and around the world. A striking chart I often like to show in my presentations is one of the density of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the last 2,000 years. And what it shows is pretty much no movement at all for a long period, and then a vertiginous leap upwards after the Industrial Revolution. And really, there's a strong scientific consensus that this needs to be reversed. But as we know, unfortunately, the speed at which the world's economies are moving towards net emissions is very, very slow, probably slower even than that agreed at the time of the Paris Agreement in 2015. So it looks now like the world's temperatures are going to be at least 2.5 degrees above normal by the end of the century. And even now, with temperatures only 1.3 degrees higher, we're already seeing disastrous impacts on weather conditions and ultimately on living standards around the world. And this is a huge challenge for governments to face, and firms and households are definitely going to face a very tough task. I guess one could say that with technical progress in carbon capture, it's possible that these predictions are maybe too pessimistic, and of course the investment boom in green technologies should also help as well. Well, the issue of ESG, and that stands for environmental, social and governance, is now front and centre. Company executives and investors often want to do the right thing, but they're also uncomfortable about compromising their business and investment objectives. And in my view, a lot of nonsense is talked about there not being a trade-off between ESG and business objectives, but there almost always is. So there needs to be clarity of thinking about exactly what the desired outcome is. Now, increasingly, regulations are being brought in that will be requiring companies and investors like pension funds to place more weight on these broader objectives, but it is important to be honest about how this might have short and long run consequences, both good and bad. Well, undoubtedly the answer to that question, and probably the question I get asked most often, is about the impact of artificial intelligence, AI. This is certainly going to be critically important for businesses to understand, even if we dismiss, probably rightly, all the scare stories about robots taking over the world. At the moment, we're a long way off so-called super intelligent AI, but even the specialized AI, that's the sort that's tuned to a specific task, that's currently in widespread use, well, that's already rendering many human endeavors redundant, even if it is providing the potential to improve living standards. So this really does raise interesting questions about the future of work, whether we will end up as leisured classes with machines doing all the work for us, a bit like in that Pixar film WALL-E, or do we face a future where the benefits of AI go to a privileged few and the rest suffer from high unemployment and all the social and medical consequences that go with it? Now, there's a lot of important work going on in this area, and I'm very happy to elaborate on that.